Today, we're diving into something pretty serious. What happens when our body's command center, the central nervous system, gets attacked by an infection? It's a heavy topic for sure, but really understanding it is the best way to know what to look for. So let's get into it.
We've all had a bad headache, right? But I want you to imagine one that comes out of nowhere and is so intense it's unlike anything you've ever felt. It's a scary thought, and it's often the very first alarm bell for the kinds of infections we're going to talk about today, where a single symptom can signal a major emergency.
You know, you can think of your brain and spinal cord as being inside a fortress. The skull and spine are the outer walls, obviously. But inside that, you have these special protective linings called the meninges. As you can see here, there are multiple layers that create this vital barrier. But what happens when that barrier is breached? Well, that's exactly what we're here to break down today. Central nervous system infections, or CNS infections for short. We're going to explore what happens when invaders, like bacteria or viruses, get past those defenses and set off a crisis inside the command center. So, what are we talking about exactly? A CNS infection is basically an inflammatory disease caused by some kind of pathogen. It can hit the protective linings, the brain itself, or the spinal cord. We're going to focus on the three main ways this attack can look: meningitis, encephalitis, and a brain abscess. Let's kick things off with the one you've probably heard of, meningitis. If we go back to our fortress idea, this is like an attack on the gates and the walls, the meninges. It's when those protective layers around the brain and spinal cord get all inflamed. And what's really striking is just how common the classic warning signs are. The data shows that a huge majority of people with meningitis get a killer headache, a high fever, a stiff neck, or some kind of mental change, like getting really confused. These aren't just little symptoms, they're the body's emergency flares going off. Now, it's not just about what a patient says. Doctors actually have these specific physical moves they can do to check for irritation of the meninges. And we're not talking about fancy machines here. These are simple, powerful clues they can find right there at the bedside. And this shows two of those key tests perfectly. Over on the left, you've got Koenig's sign. Basically, if a doctor tries to straighten out a patient's leg at the knee and it causes a lot of pain, that's a positive sign. And on the right, that's Brudzinski's sign. If lifting the patient's head forward makes their knees and hips bend up automatically, well, that's another huge red flag that the meninges are inflamed. So here's the bottom line, and this is huge. These signs aren't some rare thing. A major study found that a whopping 95% of patients with bacterial meningitis, the really dangerous kind, have at least two of those four classic signs we just mentioned: headache, fever, stiff neck, and confusion. It's an incredibly consistent pattern. Okay, but what if the infection gets past the walls and into the city itself? Well, that's when we're talking about encephalitis. Now it's not just inflammation of the linings, this is a direct inflammation of the brain tissue itself. And this MRI gives you a pretty stark picture of what that looks like. You can see those bright areas showing swelling deep inside the brain. See, unlike meningitis, which is on the outside, encephalitis is like a fire has broken out inside the brain structures, causing chaos everywhere. And because the brain tissue is the part that's actually affected, the symptoms are all about brain function. This is where you get that deep confusion or major personality changes, seizures, hallucinations, or even specific problems like weakness down one side of the body or not being able to speak. These are the signs that tell doctors the problem is in the brain, not just around it. All right, on to our third type of infection, which is different all over again. A brain abscess isn't a widespread fire. It's more like a localized, walled-off battle. It's like the body tried to contain the infection by building a capsule around it, creating this little pocket of infection deep in the brain. And you can see that so clearly on the CT scan. Look at that distinct ring-like shape. That's the abscess. It's a focused infection that's been contained. That's totally different from the diffuse, widespread swelling that we saw with encephalitis. But here's the catch. The source material makes it clear that brain abscesses can be incredibly sneaky. This quote points out that the so-called classic trio of symptoms, headache, fever, and a specific neurological issue, shows up in less than half of all patients. That makes it really tricky to diagnose and means doctors have to be on high alert. So you've got these three terrifying possibilities. How on earth do medical professionals fight back? Let's talk about the counterattack, how these infections are actually diagnosed and treated, because, and I can't say this enough, time is everything. To fight an infection, you first have to know what you're fighting. Is it a bacteria? Is it a virus? To figure that out, you need to get a sample of the fluid that bathes the entire central nervous system. It's called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And this is how they get that sample. It's a procedure called a lumbar puncture, or you might know it as a spinal tap. I know it can sound intimidating, but this illustration shows how a needle is put in very carefully in the lower back, way below where the spinal cord actually ends, to safely draw out a tiny bit of that crucial fluid for testing.
And once they have that fluid, the lab can find some major clues. This table breaks it down pretty simply. With bacterial meningitis, the fluid is usually full of fighter cells called neutrophils, and the bacteria have eaten up all the sugar, so the glucose level is low. With viral meningitis, you see different cells, and the glucose is usually normal. This one test is absolutely fundamental for deciding what to do next. And here's what's so critical. With bacterial meningitis, every single minute counts. The protocol is all about speed. If a doctor even suspects bacterial meningitis, they start high-dose antibiotics right away, sometimes even before they do the spinal tap. You just don't wait for proof, because any delay can have devastating results.
From that point, the treatment plans go in totally different directions. Bacterial infections are an all-out war that requires powerful antibiotics and often steroids to bring down the inflammation. A lot of viral infections, on the other hand, will actually resolve on their own. The body's immune system handles it. Though some viruses, like herpes simplex, do need specific antiviral drugs. So let's just do a quick recap of the 3 types of siege. You've got meningitis, which is inflammation of the protective linings, encephalitis, which is inflammation of the actual brain tissue, and a brain abscess, which is that walled-off, localized pocket of infection. 3 very different attacks on the central nervous system. So, what's the big takeaway here? What do you really need to remember? First, that our brain's fortress is amazing, but it's not invincible. And second, and this is the most important part, the combination of a fever with a severe headache, a stiff neck, or sudden confusion should always be treated as a medical emergency. Getting help fast is what leads to early diagnosis, and that is the key to preventing permanent, life-altering damage. In the end, the best defense isn't just in a hospital, it's awareness. Knowing these signs is the first line of defense for you and for the people you care about. So the real question is, are you prepared to recognize the alarm when it sounds?